Comment on the video, where are people watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm excited to kick off today's video by getting to know you a little better. Let me know down in the comments where you're watching from, whether you're sipping your morning coffee in a bustling city or relaxing in a quiet suburb. I love connecting with all of you. Before I dive into today's story, I want to share a bit about my past run-ins with what I call Karen problems. Yes, you heard that right. I've had my fair share of encounters with overly entitled personalities demanding unreasonable favors or complaining about the slightest inconvenience. Trust me, as someone who's managed multiple high-end properties, these experiences have taught me a lot about handling difficult guests with a blend of patience and resolve. Speaking of properties, let me set the scene for what might just be my most memorable poolside fiasco yet. I take pride in keeping my home and its amenities in pristine condition, especially my pool, a personal oasis where I unwind and entertain a few close friends when the time is right. However, not all visitors understand boundaries, and sometimes, unexpected characters decide that they've struck gold without even trying to earn it. Enter Mildred, a woman whose casual disregard for rules turned my quiet pool area into a stage for chaos. It started innocently enough. Mildred claimed that the exorbitant HOA fees in her neighborhood made it impossible for her to afford a pool. With that excuse, she began using my pool almost as if it were a public amenity. At first, I was inclined to brush it off politely, thinking she was simply looking for a way to cool off on a hot day. But as time went on, her behavior grew increasingly intrusive. Mildred wasn't content with a brief dip. She'd arrive with an assortment of inflatable flamingos, pump up the volume on her favorite Kenny G tracks, and even host impromptu water aerobics classes as if my pool were her personal gym. I tried to handle it diplomatically at first. After all, everyone has their quirks, right? But when polite requests went unheeded and my carefully maintained oasis started turning into a chaotic splash zone, I realized something needed to be done. In today's video, I'm going to walk you through exactly how it all unfolded, from my initial invitation to viewers like you to share your thoughts, to the escalating poolside antics that led me to make a tough decision. I'll share the steps I took and the lessons learned in dealing with a situation that quickly went from mildly annoying to full-blown property infringement. So, buckle up and get ready for a story that combines everyday frustrations with a touch of humor, a dash of disbelief, and ultimately, a whole lot of determination. And remember, if you've ever dealt with your own Karen problems, hit that like button and share your experiences in the comments below. Now, without further ado, let's dive into the saga of Mildred and the pool that wasn't quite so private anymore. After my introductory remarks and a brief recount of past Karen encounters, the day's tone took a curious turn. It all began when Mildred, a persistent and unconventional guest, first appeared at my property. Claiming that the hefty HOA fees in her own neighborhood left her unable to enjoy a pool of her own, Mildred casually sauntered into my private oasis. At first, her presence was almost endearing, an unexpected plea for respite on a scorching afternoon. With a light-hearted excuse about financial constraints and a sincere smile, she positioned herself at the edge of my pool, seemingly oblivious to the fact that it was a private amenity meant solely for my enjoyment and the select company I invite. Mildred's initial foray was accompanied by polite conversation. She explained her predicament as if her inability to afford a pool was an inevitable aspect of modern living. I, being a patient host, listened as she rambled about the exorbitant fees that plagued her community, fees that, in her eyes, deprived her of the simple pleasure of a cool dip. Though I felt a tinge of indignation at the casual crossing of boundaries, I chose to handle it diplomatically. I invited Mildred to relax by the poolside but subtly made it clear that my property was private. However, what began as an isolated incident soon marked the onset of a pattern. Over subsequent days, Mildred returned with increasing frequency. Each arrival was less of a courteous request and more a disruption to the serene order I had painstakingly maintained. What had once been an anomaly became a source of brewing frustration. I watched as she barely acknowledged any personal space, setting her personal agenda against the backdrop of my carefully curated environment. The gentle splashing in the water, the polite chatter that quickly evolved into unsolicited chatter, and even her casual disregard for the clearly posted, private property, signs formed an unmistakable pattern. It wasn't long before Mildred's insistent behavior began to disrupt not only my quiet moments by the pool but also the overall atmosphere of respect for personal boundaries that I had worked so hard to establish. By the end of that fateful day, a sense of inevitability had crept in. It was clear that Mildred's casual entrance was just the opening act of a much larger drama, a drama that would challenge both my patience and my resolve. I knew then that if such transgressions continued, would be forced to consider more definitive steps to protect my sanctuary. This was not just about one uninvited guest anymore. It was about upholding the values of privacy, respect, and proper usage of one's personal property. And with every return, Mildred's presence accentuated the need to resolve the issue before it escalated further. As the days wore on, Mildred's behavior evolved from a mere casual visit into a full-fledged intrusion. One afternoon, I returned home to discover that Mildred had transformed my pool into a vibrant, albeit unauthorized, aquatic event. There she was, accompanied by a cluster of bright inflatable flamingos, the air filled with the mellow, sultry strains of Kenny G. Without waiting for an invitation, Mildred had taken it upon herself to host an impromptu water aerobics class. She floated freely in the pool, orchestrating her own little workout session as if my private space were a public fitness center. Her energy was infectious, and her movements were choreographed to the saxophone solos that filled the air. Despite several gentle reminders of the property's private status, Mildred continued her exuberant display. Even as I politely approached to ask if she could tone down the volume or conclude her session, she smiled serenely and simply waved off my concerns. The contrast was striking. On one hand, I prided myself on maintaining a tranquil space where relaxation and quiet reflection were paramount. On the other, Mildred's buoyant presence and vibrant accessories turned the pool into a makeshift community center. I attempted various polite tactics, from discreetly raising my voice to dropping subtle hints about the boundaries of private property. Yet, every effort seemed to slide off her like water from a duck's back. Mildred continued her classes as though she were the designated instructor at a popular outdoor gym, unconcerned with any polite objections. Her persistent disregard for the established rules became a daily disruption. Every time she played those smooth Kenny G tunes, the melody served as a constant, uninvited reminder of her invasion. And the inflatable flamingos, once merely kitschy decorations, now took on a symbolic role, harbingers of an era where my space was no longer exclusively mine. I found myself increasingly torn between the desire to remain courteous and the need to reclaim the sanctity of my property. As the days turned into a surreal blend of tropical parties and unauthorized water aerobic sessions, I realized that my initial attempts at civility were proving futile. Mildred was not merely seeking a place to cool off, she seemed determined to create an entire world within the confines of my poolside, one where boundaries were blurred and rules were merely suggestions. The ongoing disregard for my clearly marked private space prompted me to consider that a gentler approach would soon need to give way to a more assertive solution. The situation, once merely a minor inconvenience, was rapidly escalating into a full-blown disturbance that infringed on my rights as a property owner. That realization set in as I watched Mildred lead another class with a contagious smile, completely unbothered by my growing frustration. Despite my repeated polite requests to refrain from using my pool without permission, Mildred continued to disregard the boundaries I had clearly established. Her behavior was no longer a matter of misunderstanding, it had evolved into a calculated, stubborn persistence that undermined my right to enjoy my private retreat. Over time, my initial attempts at gentle persuasion turned into quiet exasperation as Mildred flaunted her newfound dominion over my pool area with unabashed confidence. Each day, as I stepped outside only to find Mildred orchestrating yet another pool party, complete with an array of inflatable flamingos, loud Kenny G serenades, and lively water aerobic sessions. I realized that further polite negotiations would yield no change. Mildred seemed to operate on her own internal timetable, unconcerned with the rules others held dear. I had grown accustomed to her dismissive smile and her casual, "Oh, don't worry about it," responses. But there came a point when a private oasis transformed into a public spectacle would no longer be tolerated. After one particularly disruptive afternoon, when the pool had been transformed into a makeshift aquatic carnival and my repeated requests were met with nonchalant dismissal, I knew I had to act decisively. It wasn't simply about reclaiming my space, it was about reinstating the principle that private property deserved respect. With every unattended splash and every disregard for my clear reminders, Mildred was making a statement that my home was open for public use, and that was a notion I could no longer entertain. I spent that evening contemplating possible solutions, none of which involved mere words. I considered the legal and personal implications of taking a more assertive approach. The prospect of confrontation weighed heavily on me, yet the need for change was undeniable. I pondered over the various strategies that could restore the sanctity of my property without escalating the situation into a petty feud. In my quiet deliberations, I mapped out a plan that was as unorthodox as it was necessary. The idea was to devise a method so inherently effective that it would make Mildred reconsider every uninvited visit. I envisioned a solution that went beyond verbal reminders or even legal warnings, a solution that would employ an element of deterrence without resorting to outright hostility. A moment of clarity struck me: Mildred, for all her insistent cheerfulness, had one very identifiable weakness. She was extremely frightened of dogs. The thought sparked a plan that promised to be as creative as it was decisive. I resolved that if my gentle attempts had failed, then a measure of enforced security was the only recourse. It was now time to protect my property with a deterrent that would be impossible to ignore. The idea was simple yet effective: introduce a well-trained guard dog to patrol my pool area, a living reminder that my property was not to be trifled with. This step, though drastic, was the culmination of the accumulating disrespect that Mildred had shown. The decision was not made lightly. I reviewed my options, weighing the potential benefits against the possibility of further disruption. The thought of replacing polite discourse with assertive defense went against my nature, but the preservation of my sanctuary demanded uncompromising action. That night, as I sat alone and reflected on the day's relentless chaos, I resolved that drastic measures were now unavoidable. I would protect my property, and my peace of mind, by any means necessary. Thus, I set in motion a plan that would soon change the balance of power. It was not a step taken in anger alone, but one born of the firm belief that my right to privacy and the sanctity of my home must be preserved at all costs. And so, as dawn broke the following day, I knew that the next chapter of this saga would be defined by an assertive stand, a stand that would show Mildred, and anyone else who dared to cross my boundaries, that respect for private property was non-negotiable. Realizing that the time for passive measures had long passed, I began formulating a plan that would offer an unequivocal deterrent. While I had initially hoped to resolve the poolside invasions through polite negotiations, Mildred's consistent disregard for my personal space left me no choice but to escalate. It was then that I recalled a key detail: Mildred had once confided, in passing, about her deep-seated fear of dogs. This vulnerability, as ironic as it sounded, presented the ideal solution to the escalating problem. I set my mind to acquiring a Belgian Malinois, a breed famed for its intelligence, agility, and protectiveness. I believed that a well-trained dog of this caliber would be the perfect guardian for my pool area, deterring any unwarranted visits with its imposing presence alone. The thought of having a loyal, formidable animal patrolling my property filled me with a renewed sense of resolve. This was not merely a matter of self-defense, it was a statement, a declaration that my space was sacred, and any violation of it would be met with prompt and effective action. To begin the process, I conducted extensive research on reputable breeders and training programs. The journey was rigorous and required attention to detail. I reviewed countless profiles, scrutinized health records, and even scheduled in-person visits to various breeders known for their stringent standards. Every step was aimed at ensuring that the dog I chose would not only be a physical deterrent but would also embody the discipline and loyalty required for this unique task. Simultaneously, I enlisted the help of Karen, a trusted friend with extensive experience in animal behavior and training. Her insights were invaluable as she helped me evaluate the temperament and capability of each prospective candidate. Over several weeks, we navigated through trials and assessments, including background checks and psychological evaluations, to identify the ideal match. Finally, after a meticulous selection process, I found the perfect companion for my mission. I named him Pulse, a fitting name that resonated with both strength and a promise of unwavering protection. The acquisition of Pulse marked the beginning of an intensive training regimen. I made it a priority to integrate him seamlessly into the dynamics of my property. With Karen's expert guidance, Pulse underwent rigorous training sessions tailored specifically to guard the pool area. He learned commands to respond immediately to any intrusion and was conditioned to recognize the boundaries of his territory. Interestingly, I discovered that using a unique approach involving Mildred's favorite Kenny G music could play a role in his training. The gentle, yet persistent saxophone melodies were incorporated as a subtle cue during training exercises, further reinforcing his alertness and readiness. Every day, as Pulse's training progressed, his transformation became evident. His alert posture, quick response times, and imposing presence provided me with a growing sense of security. I began to envision a future where my pool would finally be safe, a sanctuary free from the unwanted disturbances that had plagued me for so long. Pulse was no longer just a dog, he was the living embodiment of my resolve to reclaim control over my property. With each completed training session and every command mastered, I felt a step closer to restoring the rightful sanctity of my space. The once timid idea of a deterrent had materialized into a concrete solution, a solution that was both humane and fiercely effective. Pulse was primed to serve as a constant reminder that my property was not open to exploitation and that any further disregard for its privacy would have significant consequences. By the time Pulse's training had reached a satisfactory level, my resolve was unshakable. I knew that, when the time came, my well-trained companion would deter Mildred's unwanted visits and enforce the boundaries that had been repeatedly ignored. The process, although demanding, reaffirmed my belief in the importance of protecting one's personal space, no matter the cost. Once Pulse had joined my household, the next phase of my plan was to fully equip him with the training needed to defend my pool and maintain the privacy of my property. The rigorous process that followed was nothing short of demanding. Every session was designed to ensure that Pulse not only understood my commands but also took on an almost instinctive role as protector of the premises. Under Karen's close supervision and with my constant involvement, Pulse underwent a series of structured training exercises. These sessions were aimed at reinforcing his boundary detection skills and teaching him to differentiate between friendly visitors and intruders. We started with basic commands, sit, stay, and come, but quickly progressed to more advanced behavioral conditioning focused on property defense. In simulated scenarios, Pulse was trained to recognize subtle cues that indicated an unwelcome presence near the pool, and to act accordingly. One of the most innovative aspects of his training involved incorporating Mildred's own quirks into the exercises. Knowing that she was particularly fond of Kenny G music, I arranged for periodic sessions where soft, mellow saxophone tunes played in the background. This unusual but effective strategy conditioned Pulse to associate any disturbance accompanied by that specific melody with the need to be especially alert. Karen explained that by linking the familiar sound with a defensive response, Pulse would soon react instinctively to any situation reminiscent of previous intrusions. Pulse quickly embraced his role as a guardian. His responsiveness grew notably with every training session. When faced with mock intrusions, a staged scenario designed to mimic the unwelcome entry of an uninvited pool user, Pulse reacted swiftly, positioning himself strategically and barking assertively. His body language evolved to become both intimidating and reassuring, a steadfast barrier between my private space and any disruptive force. The transformation was remarkable. My home, once under threat of unauthorized aquatic parties, now pulsed with a renewed sense of control and security. In parallel with these intensive training sessions, I ensured that Pulse's mental and physical health were also meticulously monitored. Regular checkups, exercise routines, and nutritional planning were integrated into his daily regimen to maintain peak performance. Karen's expertise was invaluable throughout this period, as she ensured that every aspect of his care contributed to his overall readiness to defend our boundaries. The entire process instilled in me a deep sense of confidence. Each passing day confirmed that Pulse was not just a deterrent by presence but a fully trained guardian, capable of enforcing the rules of my private domain. It was an investment in both security and peace of mind, an investment that would ultimately allow me to reclaim my property from persistent intrusions. By the time the training phase had concluded, Pulse had become a stalwart protector, a living, breathing emblem of the new measures I had implemented. I knew that, come the moment of confrontation, he would act without hesitation or second thought. And so, with Pulse's training complete and his abilities honed to perfection, I felt ready for the inevitable next chapter, a chapter where my property's sanctity would once again be defended without compromise. The stage was set one warm afternoon when Mildred appeared once again at my pool, this time for what would be her final and most fateful visit. The air was heavy with anticipation as I, resolute and determined, prepared to introduce Pulse to the scene of the ongoing intrusion. The pool, which had long been subjected to Mildred's unabashed use for water aerobics, inflatable flamingo displays, and loud Kenny G ballads, was about to be reclaimed. I stood at the poolside, my heart pounding steadily as I watched Mildred begin another one of her impromptu sessions. Gathering my composure, I signaled for Pulse, a quiet yet imposing figure whose training was now fully in bloom, to join me. With controlled precision, I called him over. Pulse trotted toward the water's edge, his eyes alert and his posture commanding respect. In that moment, the scene shifted dramatically. Where Mildred had once reigned unchallenged, now there was an unmistakable authority on duty. I stepped forward and, with calm authority, introduced Pulse to Mildred and her small entourage of friends. The contrast could not have been starker. Mildred's previously carefree demeanor began to waver upon seeing the formidable Belgian Malinois by my side. Pulse's presence was as silent as it was persuasive, an embodiment of the secure boundaries I had worked so hard to enforce. His trained alertness, combined with the quiet determination in his eyes, sent a shiver down the spines of everyone present. Mildred, unaccustomed to being confronted with such unwavering force, faltered momentarily. The usual cheerfulness was replaced by a flicker of anxiety. I spoke calmly but firmly, making it clear that my property, and the sanctity of my private pool, could no longer be compromised. "This is my home," I stated, my voice unwavering. "And these boundaries are not up for negotiation." Pulse paced slowly by my side, a living reminder that any further intrusion would be met with immediate and definite action. The confrontation escalated as Mildred attempted to salvage her position by mumbling excuses and deflecting responsibility. But as she looked into the determined eyes of both me and Pulse, the futility of her situation became painfully clear. Her defenses crumbled under the weight of the combined authority I now wielded, an authority that was not just spoken of in words but embodied through actions and the presence of a vigilant guardian. In those tense moments, the pool transformed into a microcosm of the larger struggle for respect and personal space. The stakes had never been higher, and the outcome was inevitable. Mildred's earlier bravado dissolved into palpable fear as she realized that her uninvited rule over my pool was coming to a definitive end. The assembled onlookers, who had borne witness to this saga over time, sensed the gravity of the moment as Mildred's friends exchanged worried glances. As the confrontation reached its climax, I reiterated my stance: any further disregard for my property's privacy would leave no room for polite negotiations or half-hearted apologies. The message was unambiguous: my home, and the peaceful sanctity of my pool, would be defended at all costs. Pulse's steady presence, his training now a vivid reality, was the final, silent arbiter. By the time Mildred, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events, began to retreat with her friends, the tide had unmistakably turned. The power dynamic had been rewritten that day, one where my right to private property and the security of my domain were non-negotiable. The dramatic confrontation had not only restored order but also sent a resounding message: respect for boundaries was paramount, and any violation would be met with unequivocal resistance. The aftermath of the confrontation left the atmosphere charged and the poolside eerily quiet. Mildred, now visibly shaken, was forced to face the reality of her actions. As I watched from a respectful distance, Pulse approached her, not with aggression, but with the measured calm of a well-trained guardian. Instead of biting or displaying overt hostility, Pulse did something unexpected. He gently splashed Mildred with water. The surprising act of a splash, rather than a bite, carried an almost surreal quality. For a brief moment, the tension that had defined the earlier altercation gave way to a scene that was both humorous and heartbreaking. Mildred's initial reaction was one of shock. Her eyes widened as the cool water cascaded over her, momentarily disrupting her semblance of defiance. What followed was an emotional breakdown, a raw, unfiltered display of fear and regret that caught everyone off guard. In that moment, the fierce persona Mildred had maintained for so long shattered. The sound of splashing water punctuated the charged silence, and her once stubborn features crumpled into a look of utter vulnerability. With her friend standing by in stunned silence, Mildred's facade gave way to despair. Overwhelmed by the cascade of emotions, she turned and fled the pool area, her retreat marked by scattered whispers and sympathetic glances from those who had witnessed the event. The scene was as much a victory of defense as it was a somber lesson in the price of disrespecting someone's private space. The gentle reprimand by Pulse, an act that neither injured nor viciously attacked, conveyed a powerful message. While my property was inviolable, there was still room for measured, non-violent enforcement of boundaries. For me, the sight of Mildred's emotional breakdown, though tinged with a sense of closure, also carried a hint of melancholy. It was a moment that underscored the inevitability of consequences when one repeatedly trespasses against established limits. The pool, which had once been the focal point of persistent infringement, now stood as a symbol of reclaimed peace and security. That day, as I surveyed the now quiet poolside, the resolution of the conflict was unmistakable. The carefully orchestrated balance between assertiveness and restraint had prevailed. Mildred's breakdown was both a warning to any would-be intruders and a reminder that respect for personal boundaries was paramount. The echoes of that transformative moment resonated long after Mildred had disappeared from view, leaving behind a powerful testament to the strength of defending one's private domain without resorting to excessive force. No sooner had the dramatic showdown concluded than the distant wail of sirens punctuated the calm of my newly reclaimed space. It turned out that in her desperation, Mildred had decided to call the police. Within minutes, local law enforcement arrived on the scene, their flashing lights briefly intermingling with the last rays of the setting sun. The officers, initially expecting a chaotic confrontation, were instead greeted with a scene of remarkable order. After a brief investigation and discussions with both me and the arriving officers, it became evident that my actions, though bold, were entirely within the bounds of the law. The police found that I had every right to protect my private property and that my measured, non-violent approach was both reasonable and commendable. Their approbation provided not only validation but also a sense of finality to the tumultuous events of the day. During the formalities and debriefing, it was made clear that Mildred's repeated intrusions, combined with her violation of clearly marked private property, left her with little room to argue. The officers, acknowledging the legality of my actions, noted that the situation had been handled with both tact and firmness. The commendations I received from the law enforcement officials bolstered my resolve, affirming that what started as a mere nuisance had culminated in a necessary restoration of order. In the days that followed, Mildred's presence in the neighborhood rapidly diminished. Whether by her own volition or due to mounting pressure from community members and the official reprimands, she was forced to leave the area. The departure was a bittersweet reminder of the cost of overstepping boundaries, yet it also signaled the complete restoration of the peace and privacy I cherished. With Mildred gone and the police report in my favor, I could finally reclaim the full, untroubled use of my pool. The entire ordeal, though emotionally draining, had reaffirmed the importance of standing firm in the face of repeated transgressions. For anyone who has ever had their personal space invaded, this episode served as a powerful testament. Your rights are yours to defend, and sometimes decisive action, not merely polite requests, is necessary. As I settled back into the tranquility of my private retreat, the pool once again became a sanctuary. The events of the past days, the confrontations, and the ultimate intervention of the authorities all underscored the value of maintaining one's boundaries. With the support of local law enforcement and the silent guardian in the form of Pulse still by my side, I was ready to move forward, confident that my space, and my peace, had been rightfully restored. In the wake of the police intervention and Mildred's subsequent departure from the neighborhood, a profound sense of relief and reclamation settled over my property. The long saga, from casual intrusions to dramatic confrontations, and finally, to the intervention that restored order, had reached a satisfying conclusion. With the police's official report validating my actions, I was left not only with a sense of personal vindication but also with the recognition that sometimes, standing up for your rights demands both resolve and ingenuity. That evening, as twilight settled and the familiar hum of a peaceful neighborhood returned, I took a moment to reflect on the extraordinary events that had unfolded. My pool, once a stage for relentless and unsolicited water aerobic sessions, was now secure and exclusively mine. The air was calm, and the gentle ripple of water across the surface was a welcome symphony after days marked by tension and uncertainty. The commendation from the police had not only solidified my position but also sent a clear message throughout the community: disregard for private property would not be tolerated. Neighbors, both long-standing and new, acknowledged that the measures taken were legal, measured, and necessary. Their quiet nods and supportive glances served as a poignant reminder that the balance between communal living and individual privacy was being respected once again. With Mildred out of the picture and my pool's sanctity restored, I also took a personal step forward. I rewarded the efforts that had helped secure this victory, a gesture of gratitude to everyone who had backed the decision, and especially to Pulse, whose presence had turned the tide. More than a mere bonus, it was a reaffirmation of the principle that defending one's home required both courage and thoughtful action. Driving away in the evening calm, I felt a renewed sense of ownership and control. The events, while challenging, had reinforced an invaluable lesson: never compromise on what belongs solely to you. As the lights of my property receded into the darkness, the memory of this hard-won victory and the lessons learned from it paved the way for fresh beginnings and a future safeguarded by respect for personal boundaries. In that final, resolute moment, the triumph over persistent intrusion was complete. I knew that my space was once again secure, and the promise of privacy and peace would endure. This was not just the end of a conflict. It was the dawn of a new chapter defined by uncompromising self-respect and a commitment to defending one's own sanctuary at all costs.